The night pressed down heavy, the air thick with smoke and the sour bite of damp earth. Soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder, boots sinking into muck that seemed to writhe under every step. At first, they blamed nerves. War had a way of twisting the senses, but then the soil heaved, timbers cracked, and the ground itself yawned open. Shouts of warning were smothered by screams as men were dragged under, their helmets tumbling into the mud like discarded shells. By sunrise, the trench no longer held a unit of fighters, only silence and the stench of earth that had fed on the living. The night lay heavy over the trench, cloaking the men in a silence that felt unnatural. The usual hum of distant artillery had faded, leaving only the wet sound of boots squelching in mud. Soldiers whispered nervously, their breath rising in small clouds that vanished too quickly in the cold. The ground beneath them seemed softer than before, giving under their weight like soaked cloth. Some dismissed it as rainwater sinking in, but others felt a deeper unease. The trench, they swore, was no longer steady. It was breathing. A private crouched to tighten his laces, pressing a hand into the soil for balance. His fingers sank farther than expected, plunging wrist-deep into muck that oozed around his skin. He yanked free, covered in black slime that smelled of iron and rot. His comrades laughed uneasily, teasing about careless footing, yet their eyes lingered too long on the strange residue. The soil clung in strands that refused to drop away, as though reluctant to release him. By then, unease had spread like frost through the line. The trench walls sagged with moisture, earth dripping in steady rivulets that carried more than water. In the lantern glow, the liquid gleamed dark, thicker than rain, pooling at the baseboards in sluggish streams. Men lifted their boots higher, unsettled by the sound of bubbles surfacing where none should exist. The air thickened with a sour tang, stinging nostrils and burning throats. Nobody spoke of it aloud, but each soldier knew the mud had changed, become heavier, more alive than soil should ever be. A shudder ran through the ground, faint but undeniable, rattling mess tins and helmets stacked along the wall. Every man felt it travel upward through his legs, a tremor not born of shells or enemy guns. They froze, eyes darting, waiting for an explanation that never came. The vibration pulsed once, then twice before fading into stillness. No artillery followed, no advancing troops, only the mud shifting underfoot, groaning as though stirred awake. One of the sentries swore he saw the trench floor rise an inch before settling again. He rubbed his eyes, blaming exhaustion, yet the image burned in his mind, soil swelling like lungs drawing breath. His report was laughed off by command, dismissed as nerves. Still, the soldiers began to tread more lightly, avoiding stomps or heavy steps. They had begun to believe the ground itself was listening, waiting, remembering. Fear spread without a single bullet fired. Waterlogged boards groaned as if splintering under unseen pressure. Nails loosened, and the timbers that once braced the trench leaned inward with a creak that made men flinch. They tried to reinforce the walls with sandbags, but the bags slid down, swallowed by muck before they could hold. Each attempt to fight back against the collapse ended the same way, soil giving way, as though refusing to be contained. What once served as shelter had become a trap, tightening with every hour. The lanterns sputtered as if responding to the unease. Flames shrank when lowered near the mud, their glow dimming into pale shadows. Soldiers cursed and adjusted wicks, but the light refused to brighten near the ground. One man dropped his lantern entirely, and the flame hissed out in the puddle before him. The darkness surged, swallowing the space until the men huddled closer, unsure if they feared the night above or the soil below. Boots squelched deeper than they should, leaving holes that filled too quickly, as though something sucked greedily at the impressions. Soldiers muttered about the mud feeding off them, drawing strength from every step. A corporal ordered them to keep moving, insisting stillness would invite collapse. But each footfall became heavier, harder to lift, until legs ached and ankles burned. It felt less like marching and more like wading through a grave that had no bottom. The air shifted, damp and heavy, pressing low against their chests. Breathing became harder, lungs straining, as though weighed down by invisible hands. The mud exhaled foul odors that seemed to cling in throats and stomachs. Some gagged, vomiting bile into the soil, only to watch it vanish in seconds, absorbed as though consumed. Others covered their faces with cloth, but nothing stopped the stink. The ground was no longer dirt, it was appetite. The soldier leaned against the wall for rest, only for the soil to crumble beneath his shoulder. He stumbled, catching himself before falling fully into the muck. The collapse revealed a dark cavity within the wall, its depth impossible to see. A low hiss drifted out, wet and guttural before fading. The man swore he felt breath against his cheek, though no one else admitted to hearing it. They sealed the hole quickly, but the memory lingered like a scar. Rats, once bold scavengers of the trench, began to flee. Their squeals echoed as they darted up the walls and into the night, abandoning the men who cursed them only days before. The soldiers exchanged pale glances, understanding without words. Vermin sensed danger before men ever could. If the rats no longer dared share the trench, what chance did humans have of surviving what came next? The silence after their departure was worse than their presence had ever been. The soil swelled again, this time with enough force to tip over rifles leaning along the walls. The weapons clattered into the mud, some sinking before hands could retrieve them. Men cursed, scrambling to salvage steel, swallowed faster than quicksand. A few rifles were lost completely, sucked beneath with no sign they had ever existed. Weapons disappearing into dirt made the soldiers realize the truth. They were not standing on solid ground, but on something alive. Sleep became impossible. Men sat with backs pressed to boards that sagged under their weight, rifles across their laps, eyes fixed on the soil. Some swore they saw faint ripples moving across puddles even when the air was still. Others muttered of voices riding the tremors, too soft to understand, too insistent to ignore. No one dared close his eyes, fearing that when lids lifted again, the trench would be empty. The commander's patience frayed as morale collapsed. He barked orders for silence, demanding focus, but even his voice faltered at the sound of the earth groaning. He struck the ground with his cane, insisting it was nothing more than settling dirt. The moment his cane pierced the soil, however, a spray of black water erupted upward, drenching him in a foul stench. His silence afterward carried more weight than his orders ever had. As night deepened, the fog rolled in thick and low, hugging the soil like a shroud. Visibility shrank to arm's length, every shadow seeming to writhe with intent. Men strained their ears, but the only sound was the shifting of mud, slow and deliberate. It no longer mimicked weather or artillery. It moved with rhythm, with patience, like a predator stalking prey already cornered. One soldier tried to climb the trench wall, desperate to escape the suffocating dread. His boots slipped, the mud sucking at them, dragging him down. He clawed at the boards, splinters biting into his skin, but the ground clung tighter. Comrades hauled him upward, but when they pulled him free, his boots were gone. His bare feet bled, toes raw, as though something had gnawed them before letting him go. None tried to climb again. The puddles grew restless, bubbling with foul gases that carried a metallic stench. Soldiers gagged, covering mouths with trembling hands, but the vapors forced themselves through cloth. Some collapsed, choking, eyes watering as lungs burned. The mud hissed with every bubble, releasing whispers that echoed faintly in their skulls. The trench became a tomb of sound and smell, alive with a hunger that had no face. Men clutched relics from home, lockets, letters, crosses, desperate for protection. They whispered prayers, but their words faltered, swallowed by the hum beneath their boots. One man's rosary beads snapped in his hands, scattering across the mud. Each bead sank instantly, leaving no trace. His scream broke the silence, a sound of loss deeper than death. No one dared comfort him, for they feared to touch the soil themselves. The ground buckled once more, violent enough to topple men onto their knees. Helmets clanged, rifles slid, and hearts thundered in panicked rhythm. The soil shifted upward in a heaving wave, as though something vast turned in its sleep below. For a heartbeat, they all felt weightless, hovering in dread. Then the ground stilled, leaving them shaking, clinging to one another. But they all knew this was not the last warning. In the cold hours before dawn, the trench fell silent. Not with peace, but with a stillness so absolute it clawed at the ears. No tremor, no drip, no hiss of vapor. The men sat frozen, afraid to move, waiting for the next shift. Their nerves were raw, their spirits drained, and yet they understood the truth. The soil was no longer theirs to stand on. It belonged to something else, and it had only just begun to stir. The soldiers tried to convince themselves the soil was still just soil, but each step betrayed them. Their boots sank deeper than expected. Soles pulled down as though gripped from below. Men cursed, tugging hard to free their feet, the muck sucking at leather like a hungry mouth. It wasn't just mud anymore, it felt like something aware, something that clung deliberately. Every motion became a struggle against the unseen. Some tried walking faster, hoping momentum would break the strange pull. Instead, the faster they moved, the heavier the resistance grew, as if the ground punished their haste. A private tripped forward, arms flailing, his foot lodged so deep it took 2 men to drag him free. When they pulled him up, his boot was gone, swallowed whole with no trace. The loss seemed trivial, yet the image chilled them more than gunfire ever had. Dark puddles mirrored lantern flames, but ripples spread across them without cause. No breeze moved through the trench, no footsteps nearby. The water stirred from underneath, sending circles outward as though something brushed just beneath the surface. Men leaned closer, peering nervously, until bubbles broke and the stench of rot filled the air. They backed away quickly, muttering prayers, unwilling to see what else might rise. One of the older soldiers whispered a story his grandfather told him, of cursed ground where armies vanished in wars long past. He said the land itself sometimes remembered blood, drinking it so deeply that it never let go. The others scoffed, but unease etched their faces. The idea that the battlefield had its own hunger lingered heavily in their minds, growing more believable with every step. The silence pressed harder, broken only by the squelch of boots dragging through muck. It wasn't the sound of earth anymore. It was the sound of flesh pulled tight, sticky, and reluctant to release. Each man felt the vibration in his bones, as though standing on the chest of something vast, listening to it breathe. Their rifles weighed less than the dread that pooled in their stomachs. Even steel felt useless against what they sensed below. A corporal tested the ground with his bayonet, jabbing downward. The blade slid in too easily, vanishing almost to the hilt. When he pulled it back, a foul black ooze coated the metal, sizzling faintly as it touched the air. He dropped it instantly, cursing, as smoke rose from the steel. The men watched silently, understanding without words. Whatever lurked beneath could eat through iron as easily as flesh. The trench walls sagged inward, trickles of wet earth sliding down like sweat on skin. The more the men tried to brace the sides with wood, the more the walls gave way. One soldier pressed his hand against the mud to steady himself, only to feel something pulse beneath his palm. He recoiled in terror, eyes wide, insisting it had a heartbeat. The others laughed nervously, but none dared touch the walls again. Lanterns flickered weakly, their flames paling when lowered toward the ground. The closer the light came to the mud, the dimmer it became, until it barely glowed at all. The men tried raising them higher, but the shadows stretched longer, writhing as though alive. A few swore they saw faces form in the shifting dark, mouths open wide, eyes hollow and accusing. They turned away quickly, refusing to meet those phantom stares. The air reeked of sulfur and copper, a metallic tang that burned throats raw. Some soldiers gagged, retching helplessly into the muck, only to see their bile vanish before touching the ground. Others coughed violently, spitting blood into rags that stained darker than usual. They muttered that the earth was drinking not just their strength, but their very bodies, draining life one gasp at a time. A sudden tremor swept through, toppling helmets from shelves carved into the trench wall. They tumbled into the mud, vanishing instantly with faint sucking sounds. The soldiers froze, watching the soil ripple outward as though satisfied by the offering. Nobody moved to retrieve the helmets. For the first time, men who would die for each other in battle refused to risk reaching down for something lost to the ground. Rats reappeared briefly, sprinting across the trench floor, their tiny claws clicking frantically. The men cheered for a heartbeat, hoping vermin meant safety. But the rodents didn't stop. They hurled themselves into cracks in the mud, squealing as they vanished beneath. The trench filled with silence again, broken only by faint scratching beneath their feet. Hope dissolved as quickly as the creatures themselves. One soldier tried to lift a prayer, clutching his cross. His voice quavered, syllables stumbling out in broken rhythm. The sound was swallowed almost instantly, muffled as though dragged underground. His lips moved, but no one heard him anymore. When he finally stopped, pale and gasping, the ground beneath him bulged slightly. As though answering the prayer with mockery, he said nothing after that. The commander ordered them forward, insisting they couldn't afford to sit still. His voice was firm, but his steps faltered. Every stride required effort, every boot clung to by soil that wanted him rooted in place. The men followed, though their eyes betrayed fear. Discipline kept them moving, but instinct screamed with each dragging step that they were feeding something older than war itself. In the darkness ahead, faint glimmers appeared, tiny lights like stars trapped in the mud. Soldiers squinted, debating if they were reflections from lanterns, but the lights blinked, one after another, and shifted closer. Eyes, someone whispered. Too many eyes for men to count. The glimmers sank suddenly, disappearing beneath the muck, leaving only silence. Yet the men knew they had not imagined them. Suddenly, a soldier at the rear stumbled with a sharp cry. His leg had vanished into the earth up to the knee, trapped by unseen force. Comrades rushed to pull him free, straining against the suction. His screams rose as his body sank inch by inch. Finally, they wrenched him loose. But his boot remained buried, his leg torn raw and bleeding. The wound looked less like tearing mud and more like teeth marks. The lanterns dimmed further, their light swallowed by mist rising from the ground. The fog thickened with every passing moment, curling around ankles like living chains. Men kicked at it, swore at it, but the vapor clung stubbornly. Soon visibility shrank to mere feet, leaving each soldier a shadow among shadows. The ground beneath pulsed faintly, as though enjoying their blindness. One of the soldiers dropped his pack in exhaustion. The straps slipped from his shoulders, the bag thudding into the mud. He bent quickly to grab it, but the soil closed over it in seconds, leaving nothing but a faint ripple. His eyes widened, and he screamed at the others. "It's eating us." His words silenced the trench, cutting through fear already woven deep into every heart. Sleep came to none. Men sat with wide eyes, gripping rifles that seemed more symbolic than practical. They whispered to themselves, not daring to close their eyes. Some claimed to hear whispers in return, voices rising from beneath, coaxing, calling, promising safety if they only stepped closer. No one trusted the promises, yet each man felt the pull, a slow erosion of will. The night stretched into an eternity, each moment heavier than the last. Boots stuck harder, mud clung tighter, and the air grew thicker. By now, none doubted that beneath their souls, something waited. It had patience older than empires, hunger deeper than graves. And every soldier knew with chilling certainty they weren't standing on safe ground at all. They were standing on the back of something that wanted to devour them whole. When the tremor came again, stronger this time, no one spoke. The soil rose in waves, shifting like muscle under skin, rolling beneath their boots. Rifles rattled, men stumbled, and the trench walls groaned in answer. The soldiers clung to one another, terrified, knowing the truth they had tried so hard to deny. The war above meant nothing compared to what was stirring below. The sky hung heavy with clouds that smothered even the faintest starlight. Lanterns along the trench guttered low, their weak flames unable to pierce the fog pressing in from all sides. The men crouched together, hands trembling against cold steel, ears straining for sounds beyond their own ragged breaths. An unnatural quiet wrapped itself around them, deeper than any ceasefire. It was not peace, it was anticipation. The first sign came as a groan, distant and low, rolling up through the ground like a rumble of buried thunder. Helmets rattled on sagging shelves, canteens clinked against wooden braces. Every man froze, muscles stiffening, eyes darting. It wasn't artillery. They knew that sound too well. This was something slower, heavier, more deliberate, as though the soil itself was shifting beneath them. A private swore he felt the floor lift beneath his boots. His comrades scoffed until the vibration grew, rippling across the trench in waves. Boards creaked, nails popped loose, sandbags toppled into the muck. The very earth swelled like a lung drawing breath, then deflated with a sickening hiss. Terror gripped the soldiers as they realized the ground was no longer stable. It was alive. Suddenly, cracks tore across the mud, splitting wide with jagged violence. The sound was deafening, like bones snapping under pressure. Lanterns swung wildly, shadows slicing across pale faces. From the fissures oozed a black slime, thick and glistening, carrying with it a stench of sulfur and iron that made men gag. Some dropped their rifles to cover their noses, but the stench clung to them like smoke. The trench floor buckled, collapsing in chunks that sent soldiers scrambling for balance. Boots sank deep, dragged down by unseen suction. Screams pierced the silence as one man toppled, arms flailing as the ground yawned beneath him. His comrades lunged forward, but he was gone in an instant, devoured without a trace. Only the echo of his cry lingered, cut off by soil closing shut. Panic spread like fire in dry grass. Men clung to each other, clawing at boards, desperate for solid footing that no longer existed. The walls shivered, shedding streams of mud that poured into the widening cracks. The trench felt less like a fortress now, and more like a grave, its boundaries dissolving into shifting earth. Every man's mind screamed the same truth. They were trapped inside something far larger than themselves. From the largest fissure rose a sound, not quite a voice but too deliberate to be mere noise. It was a vibration that throbbed in their skulls, a guttural hum laced with menace. Some soldiers clutched their heads, blood seeping from their noses. Others collapsed to their knees, gasping, praying in broken whispers. The sound did not come from the air. It came from below, from something moving closer. The ground erupted without warning, spraying mud and splinters high into the night. Lanterns shattered, extinguishing what little light remained. In the brief flare of sparks, the men glimpsed movement, massive, writhing forms pushing upward, slick and grotesque. A stench of rot and decay poured out of the pit, burning eyes and throats. It felt as though the earth itself had vomited. The men staggered back, rifles raised, but their hands shook too violently to aim. One fired blindly into the dark, the muzzle flash revealing a vast, shapeless silhouette looming above. The bullet vanished without sound, swallowed whole by the thing rising from below. The men cursed and screamed, the trench echoing with gunfire that did nothing but illuminate their fear for fleeting seconds. The soil beneath their feet pulsed like muscle, tightening with every shot. Boards snapped, sending men tumbling into the rising muck. Some were dragged waist-deep before others could grab them. They clawed desperately at arms and uniforms, but the suction pulled harder. Limbs disappeared, torsos followed, until screams cut off abruptly, muffled by soil slamming shut. A soldier hurled a grenade into the pit, his hands trembling as he pulled the pin. The explosion thundered, shaking the trench with violent force. For a moment, hope sparked as firelight revealed the pit in terrible detail. Slick walls lined with twitching tendrils, shadows writhing like serpents. But when the smoke cleared, the fissure only grew wider, as though the blast had fed its hunger instead of stopping it. The commander shouted for calm, his voice breaking under the weight of disbelief. He demanded order, demanded fire in unison, but his words were drowned by the roar that erupted from the pit. It was not human, not animal, but something ancient and cruel, vibrating deep enough to shake teeth loose. Men clutched their heads, screaming in agony as the sound filled every space inside them. Eyes appeared next, burning like embers in the dark. Dozens at first, then hundreds, flickering across the pit's edge. They blinked in unison, glowing faintly through the mist, watching with hunger that no man could endure. Soldiers froze, unable to look away, their bodies trembling as though those eyes pulled the life from them. Rifles slipped from hands, clattering uselessly into muck, already eager to swallow them. The earth convulsed again, splitting open farther than before. Entire sections of the trench caved inward, collapsing into the abyss. Men scrambled along the walls, clawing desperately for escape, but each board gave way, sliding into the maw below. The pit widened with every heartbeat, devouring not just soldiers but the structure itself, tearing apart everything built to withstand war. Amid the chaos, a scream rose above the rest. A soldier dragged halfway down, his body bent unnaturally by unseen force. His comrades clutched his arms, their boots slipping, muscles straining against impossible strength. For a moment it seemed they might succeed. Then, with a sickening snap, the soil surged, ripping him downward. His screams ended in silence, replaced by the gurgle of earth closing in satisfaction. Black vapor poured from the pit, curling upward like smoke from a funeral pyre. It carried voices now, whispers threading through the fog, words too fractured to understand. Some soldiers swore they heard their own names, others swore they heard lost loved ones calling. The trench filled with broken cries as men clutched their ears, desperate to silence the voices that slithered straight into their minds. The commander stumbled backward, pistol in hand, but his authority had shattered. His men no longer saw him as leader, only another doomed figure trembling in the dark. He raised his weapon toward the pit, but his hand shook too violently to steady his aim. The shot fired wide, vanishing into the black. His face twisted, despair written across it, as the ground beneath him began to crumble. As the pit widened, lantern light flickered one last time. For a fleeting moment, the men saw shapes moving inside the abyss, faces pressed against the slick walls, eyes hollow, mouths open in silent screams. Some recognized fallen comrades among them, twisted into grotesque forms, pleading for release. The vision shattered as the light died, plunging the trench into suffocating black. The night carried on, endless and merciless. Screams rose, then cut short, swallowed by the shifting soil. The men fought, prayed, begged, but the pit devoured them all with patient hunger. When silence finally returned, it was absolute. The trench no longer held soldiers, no longer held life, only an open wound in the earth, steaming and pulsing, waiting for its next offering. By dawn, nothing remained. Helmets and rifles were gone, letters and photographs vanished, even footprints erased. The battlefield stood quiet, as though untouched by human hands. Only the faint smell of sulfur lingered in the air, clinging stubbornly to the soil. The world would never know the truth of what had happened here, that one night the earth itself had opened and it had fed. The trench was empty now, but the silence was deceptive. To the few who crept back days later, it felt alive with something unseen. Every step they took echoed unnaturally, as though 1,000 footsteps followed just behind them. Helmets lay scattered in the mud, but no men wore them. Rifles leaned upright against the walls, perfectly balanced, as if waiting for owners who would never return. Whispers traveled through the air, faint and broken, like voices carried from far away. Some sounded like orders barked by officers, others like jokes traded between comrades. The scouts froze at each sound, expecting survivors, yet the trench remained deserted. The voices faded and returned. Always familiar, always out of reach. It was as though the dead had refused to leave, speaking still from within the earth. One soldier lifted a helmet from the ground. The moment he touched it, a sharp cry rang out, not from his mouth, but from inside the steel. He dropped it instantly, eyes wide with terror. The helmet rolled into the mud, spinning before falling still, yet the cry lingered in the air. His comrades refused to pick up another, terrified of awakening more unseen voices clinging to lifeless things. Letters floated in stagnant puddles, ink smudged but legible in places. One scout bent down to read, lips trembling as he mouthed the words. It was a note written to a wife, unfinished, the last line ending mid-sentence. As he whispered it aloud, the air shifted. A chorus of overlapping voices rose, repeating the words back to him. He stumbled away, pale as ash, refusing to speak again. Everywhere they turned, the trench seemed full of life that wasn't there. Shadows moved where no men walked, flickering shapes crouching and rising. The scouts drew rifles, but no targets emerged. Instead, the shadows sank slowly into the soil, leaving ripples across the mud like water disturbed. Each ripple spread outward, carrying with it faint cries, laughter, pain, commands, all layered into a terrible harmony. At nightfall, the fog rolled in heavier, and with it came clarity they wished they hadn't found. Voices grew sharper, names called with precision, ranks barked as if drill sergeants marched nearby. Yet no boots struck the ground. No figures appeared in the mist. The trench pulsed with noise that belonged to the past, moments trapped in endless replay. It was not memory. It was haunting. One man raised his lantern higher, scanning the mist. Faces formed briefly in its glow, familiar and hollow-eyed. Some he recognized from reports of the missing, their features pale and sagging, as though waterlogged. They stared back at him with pleading expressions, mouths opening in silence. Then the lantern sputtered and the faces melted back into the fog, leaving only the echo of their despair. The scouts debated retreat, their nerves fraying faster than discipline could mend. Yet orders had sent them here to find the lost battalion, and they feared disobedience almost as much as the trench. Still, every step deeper felt like walking into the grip of the vanished. The air pressed against their chests, heavy with sorrow, thick with a presence that refused to be named. They began to wonder if they were still alive themselves. Objects moved on their own, as though guided by invisible hands. A discarded bayonet slid across the mud, leaving a trail as it dragged itself sideways. Canteens rocked gently, though no one touched them. One soldier's pack lifted slightly before collapsing again, straps twisting like fingers had tugged them. These were not accidents. The trench belonged to something else now, and it wanted them to notice. The men heard singing next, soft and low, drifting across the fog like a hymn. It was the same tune soldiers had sung to steel their nerves before battle. Yet the voices were wrong, too many, too layered, stretched thin and warped. The song carried no courage, only despair, twisting familiar words into lament. One of the scouts wept openly, recognizing his brother's voice among the chorus. As the hymn faded, the soil trembled beneath them. A faint vibration traveled upward through their boots, not violent but rhythmic, like a march below. They looked around, rifles raised, but no enemy advanced. The sound came from under their feet, a line of phantom soldiers keeping step with perfect unity. It was not footsteps of the living, it was an army of the lost, still marching underground. The commander of the search party tried to maintain order, barking orders to push forward, but his commands overlapped with identical ones whispered from the mist. His own voice mocked him, coming back in perfect cadence yet laced with cruelty. He faltered, his men staring at him with wide, mistrusting eyes. For the first time, authority meant nothing. The vanished had taken even his command. One soldier pressed his ear to the trench wall, hoping to catch some explanation. He froze instantly, then tore himself away, clawing at his face. Blood streamed from his ear, his scream sharp enough to rattle the others. He swore the wall had whispered directly to him. 1,000 mouths pressed against the soil, promising to keep him forever. His eyes rolled back, and he collapsed, mumbling nonsense. The survivors dragged him away, but the soil shifted again, swallowing the spot where he had stood. It sealed instantly, leaving no trace he had ever been there. The men understood then that the vanished had not merely died, they had been absorbed, taken into the earth itself. Their voices remained not as spirits, but as echoes of lives digested by a predator wearing the face of the land. Desperation bled into rage. One scout hurled his rifle into the pit, screaming at the voices to stop. The weapon clattered into the muck, vanishing instantly. The voices swelled, louder and crueler, chanting words in broken unison. His scream faltered as he realized his defiance had only entertained them. He fell silent, eyes hollow, spirit shattered by the futility of resistance. Fog thickened further, curling around ankles, pressing low like rising water. The men swore they felt hands brushing against them from below, tugging gently at their legs. Some fired wildly into the mist, muzzle flashes revealing nothing but shifting vapor. The shots rang out empty, the echoes returning louder than the blasts themselves. Each bullet seemed to feed the chorus instead of silencing it. One lantern fell, spilling its oil into the mud. Fire licked briefly across the ground, flaring in a flash of desperate light. For a moment they saw everything, the trench walls lined with pale faces, mouths frozen open, eyes wide in eternal terror. They weren't specters. They were the vanished, fused into the soil, their bodies stretched and broken. Then the fire died, and the faces sank away. But the men would never forget what they saw. The last hope crumbled with the realization that they were not searching for survivors. They were standing inside the grave itself, surrounded by echoes of men already consumed. The trench no longer needed to fight them. It only needed to wait, whispering their names until they gave themselves willingly. The vanished had become part of the earth, and soon they would too. At dawn, the scouts stumbled back, broken and hollow. They carried no reports of survivors, only haunted silence. Their faces were pale, their eyes glassy, and their lips trembled with words they dared not speak. Behind them, the trench settled into stillness once more, hiding its stolen voices beneath a mask of mud. Yet the echoes followed, whispering faintly into the wind, promising the world would never forget the vanished. The trench had claimed its men, but its hunger was not finished. When new boots pressed into the mud, the earth tightened with a patience that felt almost deliberate. Soldiers noticed quickly that once they stepped down, lifting their feet again became harder with each attempt. Some laughed at first, calling it swamp rot, until they realized the soil clung like a drowning man's grip. Every pace forward left prints that should have filled with water, yet they didn't. Instead, the impressions held shape as if molded by invisible hands. Hours later, those prints still sat there, darker than the rest of the muck, pulsing faintly. The men grew uneasy, avoiding them, but the trench narrowed so tightly that walking around was impossible. Each soldier had no choice but to step where others had already been held. When a private stumbled, falling face first, the ground responded with shocking speed. His hands plunged deeper than they should have, arms dragged half past the elbows before he screamed. Comrades yanked at him desperately, their boots sliding in the muck, but the soil resisted like muscle. With a final wrench, they tore him loose, gasping in horror as the sleeves of his uniform were shredded down to the skin. The man's arms bore raw marks, circular and deep, as though gripped by unseen jaws. His flesh bled freely, veins cut open in rings. The men wrapped him hastily, but the wounds refused to clot. Black sludge seeped through the bandages, spreading a stink that burned their nostrils. They stared, shaken to silence, for they understood this was no accident of earth, it was intent. The deeper they advanced, the stronger the resistance became. Each boot step was greeted by a sucking pull, louder and more forceful, as though the land demanded a toll. Even simple tasks like shifting weight or kneeling grew dangerous. Men leaned heavily on rifles, using them as canes, yet the muzzles sank quickly when pressed into the soil. More than once, a weapon vanished entirely, ripped away before the soldier could react. Some attempted to walk faster, desperate to break the hold, but speed only seemed to anger the unseen force. One sergeant tried sprinting across a stretch, his boots slapping hard against the muck. In an instant, both legs disappeared to the thighs, swallowed without mercy. His scream echoed, high and ragged, until others hauled him out by sheer strength. He survived, but his legs bore bruises shaped like fingers too large to belong to men. The soil began to throb in rhythm, slow and steady like a pulse. It was subtle at first, only noticeable when men crouched close to tie laces or adjust gear. But soon the vibration grew strong enough to rattle their teeth, rising from below in waves that spread outward. Every tremor felt like a demand, a reminder that they stood not on land but on the back of something breathing. Voices joined the pulse, faint and fractured. Whispering through the muck, soldiers heard their names. Curses, even pleas for help from long-dead comrades. A man bent to listen closer, ignoring his fellow's warnings. The moment his ear touched the soil, he screamed and flailed wildly, clawing at his own face. He babbled incoherently afterward, swearing something beneath had spoken into his skull. His sanity never returned. The ground did not simply pull, it taunted. Helmets left on the floor were dragged an inch at a time, sliding slowly until they disappeared into dark pools. Ammunition tins rattled, tugged down as if by invisible fingers. The men grew paranoid, tying their gear to belts with wire, clinging to every possession as though it were life itself. Yet still things slipped away, stolen quietly when their eyes turned elsewhere. When rain fell, they hoped relief might come. Instead, the storm only strengthened the soil's grip. Water filled the trench, turning the mud into black slurry, but rather than drowning objects, it devoured them faster. Men waded knee-deep, the muck tightening around calves, each step a battle for survival. Some collapsed under exhaustion, and once they fell, they were gone, dragged down before helping hands could reach them. Sleep became dangerous. Those who dozed off leaning against walls often never woke again. Their comrades opened their eyes to find empty spots where men had once sat. No screams, no struggle, just silence and the slow hiss of mud shifting. Blankets left behind sank within minutes, as though mocking the survivors with the image of vanishing lives. Sleep turned from comfort into a death sentence. One soldier dared to test the limits of the strange pull. He tied a rope around his waist, handing the other end to 3 comrades, and stepped boldly into the muck. At first, the resistance was mild, tugging only at his boots, but with every step forward, the suction intensified, pulling harder until he was buried up to the waist. His comrades strained, veins bulging as they pulled against the rope. When they finally dragged him free, his boots were gone, and so was his courage. The rope itself had frayed where it touched the ground, fibers eaten away as though gnawed by acid. They cut it into pieces and burned it afterward. Unwilling to let even a fragment linger, the message was clear. Nothing given to the trench would return unmarked. The men grew obsessive, checking their gear constantly, clinging to every scrap of equipment as if it were the last thread of humanity keeping them above ground. An eerie phenomenon followed. The ground began to echo their movements. When one soldier stomped in frustration, the soil rumbled in reply, a heavier step sounding just beneath him. When another shouted, a guttural noise rumbled from below, mimicking but distorting his tone. It was no longer a matter of earth resisting their presence. It was mocking it, reflecting back their struggle in grotesque imitation. The commander tried to keep discipline, barking orders to move carefully, but even he faltered when his own commands came back warped. His voice echoed seconds later, deep and guttural as if some vast throat below repeated him. The men looked to him with wide, terrified eyes, and his authority crumbled. For the first time, he could not deny what they all felt. The ground was alive and it listened. Panic finally overtook one group, who bolted in desperation. They sprinted blindly, splashing through muck, ignoring the commander's shouts. For a few steps, it seemed they might make it. Then the soil surged like a wave, swallowing them mid-stride. Their cries rose briefly, before cutting off in choking silence. When the muck stilled, nothing remained, not even footprints. The rest of the men understood escape was an illusion. The trench grew narrower as the walls leaned inward, shedding cascades of wet earth. Men pressed against each other, shoulder to shoulder, struggling for space. But the ground seized the opportunity, gripping harder with every shift. Boots stuck fast, refusing to lift no matter how fiercely they pulled. A few men fell to their knees, clawing desperately at their own legs, begging to be freed before they too were pulled under. Lanterns sputtered, shadows stretching across the muck like twisted hands reaching upward. Some soldiers swore the shadows themselves tightened around their ankles. Whether real or imagined, the panic spread fast. Men thrashed, stabbing bayonets into the soil, but the blades snapped, sucked into the darkness below. The trench groaned in answer, vibrating like laughter from some unseen mouth. By midnight, the survivors no longer marched. They shuffled like prisoners, every step a battle. Their eyes were hollow, their voices cracked from exhaustion, and their uniforms hung heavy with filth. The trench had become their jailer, granting them no escape, no rest, no hope. Every heartbeat brought the same truth closer. They were not walking through a battlefield, they were walking across a predator's tongue. When dawn threatened faintly at the horizon, the ground shuddered one final time. It released a long, low sigh that rattled boards and helmets alike, as though mocking their futile resistance. The men froze, drained and broken, staring at the muck that had claimed so many. They knew then that the trench would never let them go. It would wait, patient and eternal, until the last of them surrendered to its hunger. The battlefield grew unnervingly quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed into the skull and made men shiver. Not even distant artillery broke the stillness, as if the war itself had paused to watch. Soldiers shifted uneasily, whispering that they could hear their own blood rushing in their ears. Every scrape of boot or cough echoed far louder than it should have, bouncing back with unnatural weight. Silence had stopped being relief. It had become a threat. At first, the men tried to reassure themselves. They said the lull was temporary, that the enemy must be regrouping. But hours passed with no movement, no cries, not even the call of birds overhead. Nature seemed to have fled the place altogether, leaving them alone in a vacuum. The emptiness pressed on their chests, making every breath short and shallow. They realized quickly that something was listening. One soldier dropped his canteen, and the metallic clatter rang like a gunshot. Everyone froze, heads snapping to the noise. The sound should have been swallowed by mud and mist, but instead it stretched outward, lingering like a bell's toll. They waited, tense, but nothing followed, at least not immediately. The silence that rushed back in afterward felt hungrier than before, as if the earth had swallowed the sound and wanted more. The men stopped talking altogether, afraid their voices would be consumed too. Gestures replaced speech, nods and hand signals became their only means of communication. But even in quiet, the air seemed to hum faintly, a low vibration that settled in their bones. They knew the stillness wasn't empty. It was alive, feeding on every second they endured. The more they resisted speaking, the heavier it pressed upon them. Sleep-deprived and restless, one man dared to whistle softly, hoping to break the tension. The tune barely began before he clutched his throat, choking violently. His comrades grabbed him, shaking him, but no sound emerged. His lips moved frantically, his face purple, until at last he gasped for air. His voice never returned. The silence had stolen it, devouring his song like a starving animal. Fear deepened when they noticed the birds had stopped circling above. Hours earlier, the sky had been dotted with black wings, scavengers always ready to feast. Now it was empty, barren, as if even carrion knew to stay away. Not one crow, not one insect, not a single sign of life dared approach. The world had abandoned the men to the trench, leaving them alone with the silence that grew louder with each heartbeat. The commander ordered them to march, insisting forward movement would break the tension. They obeyed, boots squelching in the muck. But the noise of their footsteps only emphasized the void. Each squelch echoed unnaturally, repeating longer than it should, like a mocking refrain. The men quickened their pace, desperate to drown it out. Yet the more they moved, the more the silence magnified their every sound. It was as if the void itself was measuring them. Then came the first disappearance. A soldier walking at the rear simply vanished. No sound, no struggle, just gone. His comrades turned in horror, rifles raised, but there was nothing to aim at. His gear lay scattered, still vibrating faintly from the movement, then fell still. The absence of his cry was worse than any scream. The silence had claimed him without effort, leaving nothing but dread. Terror grew when more began to vanish, each taken without warning, a flash of movement, a muffled gasp cut short, and then emptiness. The silence devoured not just their voices but their very existence, consuming them faster than the men could process. Fear hardened into despair. If sound could not survive, how could flesh? The trench no longer felt like shelter, it felt like a throat. The men tried firing their rifles, desperate to fill the air with noise. The gunshots cracked loudly, muzzle flashes lighting the trench, but the sound died instantly. No echo, no ring of steel. The silence devoured the shots before they could breathe. Even worse, their magazines emptied with terrifying speed, leaving them with only the realization that they had fed the void exactly what it craved: more sound. Whispers began to surface, faint at first, then unmistakable. They were not the voices of the living. They belonged to those already taken, speaking from within the void. Some called for help, others begged to be left alone. But all of them spoke in tones that were hollow and wrong. The soldiers covered their ears, but the voices lived inside, bypassing flesh. The silence wasn't merely consuming, it was transforming. One soldier cracked, his sanity fraying like thread. He screamed as loud as he could, hurling every curse he knew into the trench. His voice rose to a shrill pitch, echoing for a second before being snuffed out entirely. His body fell limp, his mouth still open, lips frozen in a silent scream. His comrades dragged him aside, realizing with horror that his voice had been erased. From then on, no one dared speak. They marched in oppressive quiet, communicating only through fearful glances. Yet the silence had grown bold, creeping closer, pressing harder. Helmets creaked with the pressure of it, canteens dented inward as if squeezed by invisible hands. Men clutched their chests, swearing their hearts no longer beat at the same rhythm. Even their bodies seemed at risk of being stolen away. The fog around them thickened, shifting unnaturally with each step. Shapes flickered within it, silhouettes of the vanished men. They appeared for a moment, faces pale, eyes hollow, lips moving in noiseless words. Then they dissolved into mist, carried away by the weight of nothingness. The survivors stared in shock, realizing the silence had not just devoured voices, it had reshaped them into its own ghastly chorus. The commander, desperate, ordered everyone to stand still. He hoped stillness might stop the disappearances. For a time it worked. No one moved, no one breathed loudly, and the trench became a tableau of frozen terror. But soon the silence thickened anyway, pressing heavier until it seemed their lungs would collapse. It wanted sound, and without it, it would take something else. The men felt the pull in their bones. Lanterns flickered violently, flames dancing as though whipped by unseen wind. One by one they sputtered out, swallowed in total darkness. The silence grew deeper in their absence, heavier, more suffocating. Now the men could not see, could not speak, could not even trust their own breaths. They huddled close, clinging to each other like drowning men in black water. But no closeness could save them from the gnawing hunger in the void. Then, without warning, the trench floor groaned and split. The silence roared in triumph, though no sound escaped it, only vibration shaking their bones. Men fell to their knees, hands covering their ears, though there was nothing to hear. The void feasted on their fear, thickening around them like tar. It no longer needed to wait for them to speak. It could feed on the beating of their terrified hearts. By now, the soldiers understood that nothing could be done. Their weapons meant nothing, their discipline meant less. The silence was not an absence of sound, it was a predator, vast and patient, with an appetite that grew each time it fed. They were not soldiers in a war anymore. They were cattle penned for slaughter, their voices and bodies nothing but offerings. One by one, men sank into the ground, not with screams but with the soft collapse of bodies slipping under mud. No trace remained but ripples in the sludge, faint and fleeting. The survivors watched in numb horror, their throats tight, their lungs hollow. They dared not call out, for they knew the truth. Every sound, every whisper, every breath would be devoured, and when silence grew strong enough, it would consume the world itself. The roll call was once a comfort, a way to count the living against the dead, but when the sergeant called out names, the answers never came. One by one, the voices fell silent, until only the sergeant's hoarse shout remained. His words echoed back with no response, each unanswered name striking harder than bullets. By the time he reached the end of the list, the men realized half were already gone. At first, they clung to denial. They told themselves the missing had deserted, fled into the night for safety. But their packs, rifles, and letters from home lay scattered on the ground, untouched. No deserter left behind food or photographs of loved ones. The absence was not desertion. It was erasure. The men felt their comrades had been unstitched from reality, their places in memory growing thinner with every heartbeat. The fog closed in tighter, rolling across the trench in heavy waves. It pressed into their skin like wet cloth, leaving them shivering even in heavy coats. Shapes flickered briefly within it, shadows that looked familiar. Some swore they saw their missing friends walking at the edges, heads bowed, boots dragging. But when called to, the figures dissolved, leaving behind only the mist and the emptiness it carried. The commander tried to keep order, writing lists of names in his journal, forcing the survivors to remember who was still present. But even ink betrayed them. Names blurred on the page, fading as though the paper rejected them. By morning, entire lines vanished, leaving only smudges and stains. The commander ripped the pages free, clutching them as proof, but the blank parchment mocked him with its silence. The men began to question their own memories. A private swore he had marched beside a friend only hours earlier, yet none of the others remembered the man at all. Arguments broke out, one soldier insisting a comrade had lived, another claiming no such man existed, the trench filled with paranoia, each man doubting not only his fellows, but his own recollections. The emptiness was not just taking bodies, it was rewriting history. When rations were counted, more evidence surfaced. Supplies set for 50 were now enough for 20, yet no one had seen the missing food vanish. It was as though the battalion had been smaller all along. The survivors huddled together, staring at the dwindling piles, each tin of meat and loaf of bread a reminder that fewer mouths remained. Hunger gnawed at them, but fear gnawed deeper. What if tomorrow there would be none left at all? The soldiers began to mark their arms with knives, carving initials into flesh. They reasoned that if the ground erased their existence, at least these scars might prove they had once been real. But even those marks betrayed them. By morning, the cuts had sealed as if days had passed, leaving smooth, unblemished skin. Some men broke down, screaming that they no longer existed even to themselves. Lantern light wavered, throwing their shadows against the trench walls. At first, they moved in time with their owners, a comfort in a world of uncertainty. But slowly, the shadows began to thin. A man stood and cast no silhouette at all. Another's shadow flickered faintly before vanishing completely. By dawn, the trench wall was bare, empty of shapes. The men realized their reflections in the world were gone. Panic erupted, men clinging to one another as though physical contact might anchor them. Yet even that failed. One soldier held his comrade's arm tightly, swearing never to let go. Moments later, he stumbled forward, clutching only an empty sleeve. The body was gone, and the uniform had collapsed into the mud as though filled with nothing. His screams carried no hope, only the horror of holding proof of absence. The commander called for discipline, but even his words faltered. He barked orders to dig in, to reinforce. But the men no longer listened. Their eyes stared blankly, lips trembling, minds fractured. They had stopped being soldiers. They were prisoners in a place where identity itself was fragile, peeling away one soul at a time. No uniform, no rank, no oath could save them from vanishing. Then the trench itself shifted. Walls caved slightly, boards sagged, and the mud pressed inward. It was not the chaos of bombardment, but the slow pressure of something swallowing them whole. The men stumbled, boots sinking deeper, hands clawing at slick walls for stability. The earth pressed tighter, as though closing its grip around a body before consuming it. They felt the truth. The land itself was erasing them. Some tried to fight back, firing rifles wildly into the mist, but bullets vanished before they struck anything. Absorbed as though into water, grenades detonated with muffled pops, their sound swallowed before the echo could form. The weapons of war were useless here. This was not a battlefield where strength mattered. It was a place where existence itself was the price demanded. Despair crushed what remained of morale. Men stopped moving, stopped speaking, simply slumping against the walls with hollow eyes. Their breaths came ragged, their wills drained. They waited, not for orders, but for the inevitable moment when they too would dissolve into nothing. It was no longer a question of survival. It was a question of which name would vanish next. The fog carried faint whispers, now fragments of voices that sounded eerily familiar. Some men swore they heard their own voices among them, repeating words they had spoken earlier in the night. It was as though the void had stolen not only their comrades, but their very identities. Their pasts echoed mockingly, reminding them that their own erasure was already written. When the commander looked around, his heart froze. The trench that had once been filled with men now held fewer than a dozen. He swore there had been more only moments ago. His journal confirmed it, or should have. The pages where names had been written were blank again, the ink erased, leaving only faint indentations in the paper. His hands shook as he dropped the notebook, realizing his battalion was dissolving into myth. The last survivors clung to each other, muttering prayers through cracked lips. Their voices trembled, echoing too faintly to sound real. They swore they would not let go, that they would endure together. But even as they spoke, the circle grew smaller. Shoulders pressed tighter, hands grasped desperately, until one by one, men melted into the mist. Their promises echoed briefly before falling silent forever. The commander tried to count them, but the numbers refused to stay fixed. 5, then 3, then 7, then none at all. His mind buckled under the weight of it, unable to reconcile reality with the void devouring it. He screamed, clutching his head, demanding to know if he was even real. His voice cracked into sobs, echoing back only once before silence swallowed the sound whole. By the time the sun should have risen, only fragments remained. Helmets without heads, boots without legs, rifles without hands. The trench was littered with equipment, but devoid of men. No blood marked the soil. No bodies waited for burial. Only the absence spoke, heavy and eternal. The land did not need to kill. It only needed to forget. And then came the final theft. The commander, broken and shaking, raised his pistol to mark his existence in one last act. The shot cracked, but no sound emerged. His body slumped, the pistol clattered, and then even that vanished. The trench was empty, its story unfinished, its truth erased. Where once stood a battalion, now there was nothing. Nothing but the silence of a world that no longer remembered them. The battlefield lay still, blanketed in a mist that clung to the ground like burial shrouds. Yet beneath that calm lingered a weight, heavy and suffocating, as though the very soil remembered every life it had claimed. Boots crunched faintly in the muck, but no birds cried above, no wind stirred the trees. It was not silence that reigned here, it was possession. The land itself had become a vault of the lost. Helmets and rifles dotted the trench floor, scattered as though abandoned in haste. Yet each object seemed arranged too deliberate, like offerings left behind for something beneath. The soldiers who stumbled upon them dared not touch, fearing what unseen hands might demand in return. Even the mud around the relics bulged faintly, as if guarding them jealously. Nothing here belonged to the living anymore. Every step forward revealed more signs of those who had once fought here. Boots half buried, uniforms rotting in patches, bayonets jutting like broken gravestones, but no bodies remained. Only imprints in the soil, shallow hollows where men had lain, pressed deep as though their weight had not lifted in years. The marks were too fresh to be relics of the past, yet no one stood beside them. The ground grew restless underfoot, shifting with subtle pulses. Soldiers froze, swearing the vibrations matched a heartbeat. Each thrum rippled through the mud, stirring faint bubbles that hissed with a stench of iron. The trench no longer felt carved by shovels and shells. It felt grown, shaped by something alive that had fed on blood for too long. This was not earth. This was flesh disguised as soil. Lanterns struggled against the fog, their glow catching faces in the mud. Pale, hollow eyes stared upward, mouths frozen mid-cry. Some were clear and sharp, features unmistakable. Others were distorted, warped into ghastly masks stretched by unseen pressure. The men recoiled, some crossing themselves, others vomiting in terror. Yet even when kicked or scraped, the faces returned, as though the land replaced what it had claimed. One soldier dared to dig, thrusting his bayonet into the muck to reveal what lay beneath. He struck something solid, dragged it free, and froze. It was a skull, but not old. The flesh had not decayed fully, still clinging in wet ribbons to the bone. Eye sockets oozed black sludge, and the jaw twitched faintly as though trying to speak. The soldier hurled it away, but its features dissolved back into the soil before it landed. The deeper they moved, the louder the ground groaned. Each step released faint sighs, mournful at first, then desperate, then enraged. Some swore they heard voices within the moans, layered cries of agony from men long gone. The soil did not merely hold their remains, it carried their suffering, echoing endlessly in a chorus of the damned. Each cry was both warning and invitation, luring others closer. The fog parted briefly, revealing a stretch of trench filled with objects no one had carried. Metals gleamed faintly, wedding rings glittered in the mud, Bibles and pocket watches lay strewn about. These were tokens from generations of the fallen, relics of men whose names had been erased from records. The trench was not the grave of one battalion, it was the vault of countless souls consumed over centuries. One man collapsed to his knees, clutching a medal engraved with his own family name. He swore aloud it belonged to his grandfather, who had died decades earlier. His hands shook violently, the metal burning hot in his palm. When he dropped it, the metal sank instantly into the mud, leaving no trace. He screamed, begging for it back, but the ground only hissed in mockery. From then on, none dared touch the artifacts, yet the ground forced offerings upon them. Bayonets rose from the muck unbidden, helmets surfaced as though spit out. Journals opened to pages filled with names no one remembered. The men turned away, their sanity fraying with each new revelation. This place was not haunted, it was an archive, one that added to itself every time war brought more blood. The trench walls began to ripple, bulging outward like lungs exhaling. Impressions of hands pressed from within, clawing at the surface but never breaking free. Fingers stretched long and thin, some skeletal, others fleshed, all desperate. They writhed soundlessly, reaching for those who stared too long. When one soldier stumbled close, the hands surged forward, dragging at his sleeves until comrades pulled him back. The walls swallowed the prince without trace. Night deepened, and the glow from lanterns seemed to dim unnaturally. Yet in the darkness, faint lights rose from the soil, tiny sparks drifting upward like fireflies. At first, the men thought them harmless, but when one landed on a soldier's cheek, it burned a hole into his skin. He screamed as more sparks erupted, swarming in patterns that resembled constellations. These were not stars. They were fragments of souls, still smoldering. As exhaustion crushed their strength, the men dared not rest against the walls. Too many had already vanished in silence, swallowed whole by the hungry mud. They clustered in the center of the trench, backs pressed together, rifles shaking in their hands. Yet even here the earth shifted beneath them, throbbing like a drumbeat. Every pulse carried the same message: you are already buried. Whispers replaced the groans curling from the soil like smoke. At first they were incoherent, muttering nonsense, but soon the words sharpened. They spoke of home, of families, of promises. Broken, they spoke in the voices of those already consumed. Some soldiers sobbed, recognizing fathers, brothers, sons. Others clawed at their ears, screaming for silence. But the whispers carried truth too precise to be denied. The trench narrowed ahead, funneling them toward a pit where the ground sagged lower than the rest. The mud there churned ceaselessly, frothing with bubbles that popped and released foul steam. Faces appeared in the froth, screaming before dissolving again. The men halted, unwilling to pass, but the trench walls pressed inward, collapsing slightly, forcing them closer. They realized then there was no path forward except into the grave. One soldier hurled his lantern into the pit, desperate to see its depths. For a moment, the flames illuminated a vast hollow beneath the trench. Bones lined the walls like bricks, endless and stacked, forming the architecture of a cathedral built of death. The lantern sputtered out quickly, smothered by the stench of decay. In the darkness, the pit seemed to breathe, waiting for its next addition. The commander finally broke, dropping to his knees and begging the earth for mercy. His voice cracked, offering anything: his soul, his men, his future. The ground responded with a single shudder that toppled helmets and packs. His words had been heard, but no bargain was struck. The earth did not deal, it only consumed. His prayers dissolved into the same silence that had claimed countless others. The men fired their last shots into the ground, their rifles snapping under the pressure. Bullets ricocheted, bending midair before dropping harmlessly into the mud. The trench answered with laughter, a sound not heard but felt vibrating in their bones until they vomited blood. The grave had feasted too long to be wounded. It was not an enemy, it was a god. When dawn's light should have pierced the fog, it did not. The sky above remained gray, heavy, unbroken. The men realized morning would never come here. Time itself had been consumed, trapped in a loop where only death remained. One soldier whispered that they were already dead, that they had been walking in their own graves since the first step. His words carried no disbelief from the others. At last, the trench swallowed them one by one. Boots sank deeper, legs dragged under, torsos twisted into the soil with no resistance. Each man vanished without trace, leaving behind nothing but gear that dissolved seconds later. The ground pulsed brighter with every life claimed, glowing faintly in the mist. And when the last soldier was gone, the trench settled into silence again, waiting for the next war to feed it. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found no signs of battle, no bodies, no rifles, no trace of men who had once filled the trench with life. The ground was smooth, as if freshly laid, marked only by deep grooves curling like scars in the mud. Reports claimed the soldiers had deserted, but those who walked the site swore the earth still shifted beneath their boots, pulsing faintly as though it remembered its last meal. Perhaps the war did not claim them at all. Perhaps the trench itself was the enemy, waiting, watching, and hungry still.